RotoGrinders, welcome to Stonk Watch, where for the next 10 weeks we will examine best ball and fantasy football from a market-based perspective and the context of investing, and identify some players, quite frankly, who can help us get to where we want to go, maximizing our returns, getting to the top of these big, huge fantasy best ball tournaments on Underdog and DraftKings. On the show, we'll start out every week with a look at the average draft position data on Underdog and DK, and we'll discuss the causes and impacts of all the market moves. We'll move on from there to discuss a weekly topic and deep dive a key point of interest when it comes to drafting best ball. But first, let me introduce the players at hand here. My name is Chris Gimino. I've been projecting fantasy football and literally 16 other sports here at RotoGrinders for a decade. I've authored one of the first publicly available ownership projections for DFS, and among other things, I've been to the Fantasy Football World Championships, been beating people's asses left and right in seasonal fantasy, and of course, I've been awarded a $100,000 prize in DFS and made the Scott Fish Bowl finals, bunch of stuff. Joining me, we've got Kyle Murray. Kyle, you've been doing a bunch of stuff here for the past decade too, right, in fantasy?
Yeah, about a decade and a half, not quite a decade, but past 4 or 5 years I've been doing projections across the industry as well. So pretty similar.
Yeah, so basically, Kyle, like I said, this is what we're going to do. We're going to talk ADP. We're going to talk weekly stuff. But before we get into that, can you just explain to anyone who's kind of new, like, what is best ball?
Yeah, so, best ball is obviously a very growing and popular fantasy format, and it's pretty similar to your traditional season-long leagues that you're doing with your friends and family on ESPN and Yahoo, but there's a couple key differences, and the major difference is there's no in-season management. So that means no trades, no waivers, no in-season roster management, so you're not even setting your lineups or anything like that. So each week, your team is automatically calculated and formulated and generated the best lineup possible based on the highest scores of the week. So that's the main difference, and then obviously, with DraftKings and Underdog, the way that they're structuring their formats is it's a 4-round season, sort of. So for the first 14 weeks, the top 2 teams within their groups advance to the second round. And after that, in the second round, the top team advances to the third round, so on and so forth, up until week 17, where the final teams on Underdog, there's 217 final teams in that final group competing for the top prize in week 17.
Yeah, definitely a lot of fun. Becoming my favorite form of fantasy. Right now, I've been entering a lot of drafts. I think I'm through 20 best ball manias right now. It's really my favorite way to play season long at this point in time. So I'm excited to talk about it for the next 10 weeks. So that leads us to the idea of talking about average draft position. What's interesting about that, Kyle, is you cannot expect to draft an average draft and win one of these tournaments. You absolutely have to be looking for super teams that end up with upper percentile outcomes if you expect to finish the season in the top of one of these week 17 finals. So before we get into this week's market discussion, let's just discuss some of the principles that we think are pretty important to actually achieving that goal. First principle I want to talk about is upside. Be specific, Kyle. Like, what are we talking about when we talk about upside?
Yeah, I think the buzzwords within upside is, spike week, right? You're looking for those guys who can go out and potentially win you a week or help elevate your team to, being the highest scoring team of the week, so on and so forth. There are a lot of players in fantasy that have these archetypes given to them, high upside players and sort of safer players. It's a very common thing in DFS where you think of, cash type players versus GPP type players. And that does translate here when you're looking for upside. Another keyword we'll touch on later is volatility. And a lot of people get scared of the word volatility, but upside actually kind of incorporates how volatile a player can be, because volatility can work in your favor as well. So upside just sort of talks about the ceiling of a player. And in best ball, we like to focus on the ceiling that a player can give you any given week for something that we call spike weeks.
Yeah, so there's the idea that a player can have upside by absolutely blasting their opponents on a week-to-week basis and have these massive spike weeks. And then there's also the idea that, just quite frankly, the old traditional type of upside is we draft a player at a certain price and he ends up finishing the season with the fantasy point production of someone who could have been drafted a lot higher. And that's just basically good old-fashioned traditional sort of predicting who's going to outperform their price tag. And that's going to be a big part of upside as well. Volatility, like you mentioned, there's a couple of different ways that we can experience this and sort of attack it. I think probably the first and most important to understand is actually how you put together your teams. Yeah, can you talk about that for a little bit? What does that actually mean? Like, what are volatile draft strategies and what do they look like?
Yeah, definitely. So, if you spend any given time on Best Ball or Fantasy Twitter, you'll hear these these terms and phrases, zero running back, Q running back. These are draft strategies that you can incorporate based on how you want to organize your roster. And some of these roster constructions have increased volatility. For example, a hero running back or a zero running back strategy. Zero running back strategy when you're effectively leaving off drafting a top running back and sort of looking to capitalize on volatile situations down in the later parts of the draft. These sorts of situations can, when we're talking volatility, you kind of want to think of it as a range of outcome situation where a lot of top players in DFS and as well as best ball like to increase their need for volatility, or they're looking for volatility just for the fact that you're able to capture upside in that top end range of outcomes. While you might be taking on some risk as well with those situations, but you sort of want to lean into volatility rather than stray away from it, just because if you stay away from it, you're effectively, leaving out a lot of upside on the table.
Right. Basically, in DFS, we call those punts. Like you're not spending a lot at a certain position, and with the hope that if those particular selections outperform their price tags and, have random situations occur where they actually become very useful plays week in and week out, you could have effectively a super team where you have all the great wide receivers, all the running backs. Their lead backs got injured, and you've got 4 running backs that were backups that are now playing starting premier roles. You can have tremendous upside that way with that kind of volatility. Of course, at the price of having to draft running backs that on paper are not projected so well. Now, of course, there are some players that have volatility that actually reduces their price. Like Rashee Rice this year has some uncertainty with regards to his legal situation. I think that's driving the price down, quite frankly. Jaden Daniels and other young players who we haven't seen it on the field, like their prices may never be this cheap if they end up being the players that we think they could be. There's players in ambiguous backfields like Rico Dowdle in Dallas, where let's say he ends up winning the lion's share of touches, where that could be a volatile situation in fantasy. And then, of course, there's guys who have stunk their whole career in other situations like Mike Gesicki. Well, now he's with Joe Burrow. There's an outside shot that he can end up doing something. You got any other notes here on these volatile players?
Yeah, I mean, like you mentioned, when you're talking about guys, especially like Daniels, where we don't really have a sample. I mean, there's a reason why there are guys out there, in the media, guys who do draft analysis, comparing him to the likes of Lamar Jackson, and that obviously would be an exceptional outcome for Daniels in his career if he's nearly as good as Lamar Jackson. But when you're talking volatility, that is in the range of outcomes for Daniels as a season like Lamar Jackson produced in his first season as a real starter. So if he's able to capture that kind of upside, that's something that you don't necessarily want to miss out on. And same thing goes for Mike Gesicki. Obviously, it gets very ugly talking about a player like Gesicki who struggled, but to your point, he's in a new situation now with Joe Burrow and an elite passing offense and a team that, just in general, a little bit of a spoiler, that we're very high on here. So when you're able to sort of stay away from what people might be fearing and instead of lean into that volatility, lean into that upside that might come with a lot of risk, you're able to capture a lot of this upside.
Yeah, let's be careful about calling it very high, but yeah, you got it. We're on it a little bit here. So let's talk about the other thing, everyone's favorite topic when it comes to volatility, stacking. So basically what we're trying to do here is week to week in the regular season, we're increasing our weekly upside by having players that correlate well together. And then, of course, everyone's hot topic du jour is what's going on in the playoffs. Who can we game stack with in the playoffs to try to get our team to the very top of those standings, week 15, 16, 17. So stacking basically means we're taking the quarterback and some other players from the same team that experience fantasy point rises together. You got anything else to add here on stacking? What else should people know if they haven't heard about it before?
No, I think the key thing is that in best ball, you really should be focusing on that, and honestly should be going into drafts planning on what stacks you want to get. But we've seen it on people complaining about it on Twitter several times, especially recently, where you get your stacks taken away from you. I think it's very important to be flexible within your drafts while still trying to lean into that correlation.
Yep. So that's pretty well timed with what I want to talk about next, which is value. So when you get the idea of stacks in your mind and stacking playoff games, it's pretty easy to take a look at a player, especially one that you don't like very much, who's dropping more than a few spots. It's very rare to see guys even drop that aren't quarterbacks more than a few spots these days. The market's pretty efficient this time of year. But let's say that you do find a value. You want to be ready to say yes to that value, right? You want ideally to be able to be flexible enough to accept it when it comes. And do you have any thoughts on this? Like basically, let's not be so fixated on the game strategy of best ball that we forget to actually accept value when it comes to us.
Yeah, I think the biggest thing is, not being so stuck in your ways on a certain take. A good example I have from a couple of years ago is the Josh Jacobs situation. There were several drafts where he, fell. Wasn't a guy that I liked at all. And then, when a guy like that who is, ranked highly or being taken highly and he falls, sometimes you want to just accept the idea that maybe you aren't 100% right, because a lot can go different throughout the course of a season. So sometimes when guys fall to you, it's okay to say, okay, I'm going to, diversify the portfolio a little bit, add a little bit to a spot where maybe I am lacking here, and just accept the value when it falls to you.
Of course, when you're doing more than one draft, Kyle, everyone falls into the trap where they've got their favorite value plays. Early in the draft, the ADP is pretty close, but once you start getting past round 12, that's when things start to shake up a little bit and you start seeing things shift around a little bit. Sometimes you can find some of your favorite plays down there starting to get really high owned if you're not careful. So let's talk about diversity. This is not something we want to experience, right? We don't want 45% like, uh, Mike Gesicki, right?
Exactly. Yeah. I think this is probably the biggest difference for me, in my opinion, when you're talking about building, let's say 150 DFS lineups compared to, working within your best ball drafts, is because a lot of times drafts, they can be repetitive at times, right? You're in a spot where you like a guy and it's easy to take him over, especially if you're taking him, over ADP. But again, seasons can play out differently. Injuries can happen. Trades can happen. Wonky things can happen throughout the season, or you could just flat out simply have the wrong read on a situation. So it's important to, not go overboard when you're, trying to build these draft sets, just because of the fact that it can be very repetitive and you can fall into, the spot of taking the same guy over and over again, or the same stacks over and over again, especially if you are higher on a stack or a team or a player than the public.
And then, of course, there's some hedging that you can do if you get yourself caught up in some of these situations. First of all, if you're playing on a couple of different sites, you might find yourself really high on one side of a situation on DraftKings. Maybe take the other side a bit more often on Underdog. Depending, quarterbacks could be a situation. Quarterback scoring a little bit more favorable on Underdog. Maybe you're punting on the quarterback more on DraftKings, as an example. Perhaps your situation with, like, say, the Tennessee running backs. You're not really sure which one you want to be more overly exposed to. Certainly don't want to be 100% one or the other. You probably want to hedge that situation. Both of these guys have a decent chance to produce this year. And then, of course, with your draft structures, everyone's going to go, zero RB, hero RB. Just look at the draft board, Kyle. We'll talk about it in a second. But everyone's drafting wide receivers this year. Maybe mix in some other different kind of draft strategies every now and then, just so that you don't have 150 zero RB teams. Although, I wouldn't hate you for it. It's just, getting stuck on one strategy could lead to a little bit of clumping.
Yeah, exactly. And I think a good way to break it down, when you can actually hedge based on, the site that you're on within that situation. So, I think a lot of people will assume that maybe Tyjae Spears is the guy who's more likely to be involved in the receiving game. So maybe he's better over on DraftKings with that full point PPR. You can do a lot of things like that, but it is very important to, especially within the situation, hedge for sure.
All right. So let's get into the meat of the show here. Let's talk about ADPs. Let's talk firstly about what's happening on the upside of things in the ADP marketplace. Kyle, what's going on with the Kansas City wide receivers? I mean, we've got a really strong sense here that this is going to be an improved passing offense with the weapons that they've acquired this year. What can you tell us when it comes to Kansas City here and their ADPs? They seem to be on the rise. Receivers like Rashee Rice, Xavier Worthy, Marquise Brown. Where are we at here with the Kansas City situation as these prices rise?
Yeah, we're definitely bullish in the situation here. For the most part, there are a couple spots that we definitely differ compared to the public. Mahomes is one of our top quarterbacks, depending on the site that you're looking at. Some other, spots where ADP has Mahomes at, 3 or 4 in terms of the quarterback rankings there. I think the key difference with the Kansas City situation and our situation, and where we are sort of looking at this team, is the usage of Xavier Worthy. And this has been an internal discussion for us, mostly led by you for, the past pretty much since the draft, honestly. They obviously drafted and spent, a lot of draft capital on Xavier Worthy. They also went out and acquired Marquise Hollywood Brown. They still have Rashee Rice there. There are some off the field issues, which I'm assuming we will discuss pretty in depth shortly. And then obviously Travis Kelce still involved. So for us, we're pretty high on the passing situation here, and to a tune of that, we are pretty bullish on Hollywood Brown and Rashee Rice. But for me, at least in my opinion, I think it's a pretty clear mistake. At least I would not draft it this way for Xavier Worthy to be the number 1 Kansas City wide receiver drafted here. I think I would prefer drafting him third. And even if you just wanted to talk just based on value, I would much rather prefer Hollywood Brown and Rashee Rice at current value than Xavier Worthy.
Yeah, Brown's going at 51 right now. Worthy's going around 60, and then you're seeing Rice in the 70s right now. I think that is definitely due to the legal situation as it pertains to Rashee Rice. People are just a little bit apprehensive to what's going on there. For me, I just, I don't want to get as hot here on this show as I've been offline about the Xavier Worthy thing. Clearly, the guy's really fast. Everyone has thoughts in their head that this could be another Tyreek Hill situation. I get all that. But I do think that Rice and Kelsey, quite frankly, are going to be the ones that are going to benefit from this. You look at Andy Reid. He's here to do two things, Kyle. He's here to create space underneath for Kelsey and Rashee Rice and chew bubblegum, and he's all out of bubblegum. So I do expect that we're going to see a whole ton of Rice on the in-breaking routes that we were seeing him towards the end of last year, provided that he's on the field. I think that's a big deal to get that some sort of clarity there, but I'm not waiting. I'm drafting him now. Do you have any problems with that? I mean, I'm just not afraid.
Yeah, I mean, I think the biggest thing is it's arguably a scenario where we're talking about earlier, where if value falls to you, just accept it. I think if everything was rosy in the Rashee Rice camp with no off the field issues, I'm assuming that he would be probably closer where Worthy is, and maybe these two would even be flip flopped. But that's not the case. But when we're projecting the situation and we're expecting this team to look a certain way come week 1, I think most likely right now, Rashee Rice is going to be on the field. And, we've seen legal situations like this kind of take a long time to play out, which obviously the morality aspect of it is a lot different than when you're actually drafting. But when it comes down to what we're expecting to look like on the field right now, it's that Rashee Rice is going to be on the field and playing come week 1.
Yeah, even his underdog blurb says likely to be suspended. Well, you mentioned this could take a long time to play out. So this is a situation where I'm being a little bit bullish. Hopefully that doesn't burn me. But of course, I do think he'll be on the field eventually. So worst case scenario is I'm out of luck. And this is why I'm drafting a lot of wide receivers. Let's talk about Kendre Miller. He's up to 137 and Kamara down to 75. Are you buying or selling the situation, Kyle?
I actually flip-flopped on this quite a bit back and forth, but I think that this is a spot where I'm going to be selling on Kendre Miller, just because I think a lot of the reason why we're seeing the increased interest on Miller is due to the fact that there's some obviously rumors and reports on Kamara not being happy with his contract, and that was legitimized by him not showing up to some minicamp stuff. However, we've seen situations like this unfold 10 times over the past few years. And, if things get worked out, I don't really know if there's a real reason to be drafting Miller at an increased ADP here. So I'll probably cool off on him while the ADP is higher and maybe even grab some more Kamara with the news. At the end of the day, I think this will be probably not much of a story, as Kamara probably gets the contract situated and worked out by week 1.
It's not that I don't think Kendre Miller can get there. It's just that the coaches really expressed that he needs to see more consistency from him. He hasn't come out and been like all about having Kendre Miller, replace Kamara. And Kamara wasn't like a nothing in the passing game last year, right? Like he was actually pretty high in fantasy points per game, 4th among running backs in yards per route run, 75 catches in just 13 games. They are going to switch their offense up this year, but it's to the San Francisco offense, which also has a good amount of running back passing in it. Just going to be maybe looking a little bit different than what it looked like in past years with the Sean Payton offense with Dennis Allen. So I do think that Kamara has a chance to remain relevant here, provided that he's on the field. And I do think that he'll be on the field. I don't think he's going to be holding out into the season. Money is undefeated. Same team, Kyle. Rashid Shaheed, he's up to 105 in his ADP on Underdog. What are you doing here? Are you buying or selling Rashid Shaheed?
Yeah, I'll be buying. I'm pretty high on Shaheed this year. I like him quite a bit. I like this fit for him. The ADP is up. But at this rate, I still like him quite a bit, especially if you miss out on Chris Olave earlier in the draft. Obviously, paying up for Olave is a bigger price, so I don't mind taking the added interest of having a piece of this New Orleans passing game with Shaheed as it seems to be the clear number 2 receiving option here. I don't think he's necessarily the supremely talented possession wide receiver. I do think that maybe gets less credit for that than he deserves. He did have a 66% catch rate last year, good separation numbers, all of those good things that kind of illuminate him as a solid wide receiver. But the thing is, for me, is the spike weeks, right? The upside that he has is going to be very high. I do think that we're going to see at least a couple weeks where he's maybe part of the reason why you are a top 1 or 2 team in your league on that given week. So I like Shaheed quite a bit. 15.5 yards per catch last year. So that kind of goes to show, to illustrate the upside that he does have on a per catch basis. 5 touchdowns last year as well. But again, I think he's going to have a larger role in this offense here. So I'm very high on Shaheed.
Yeah, he seems to fit those wide receiver heavy draft structures. Right before it falls off the cliff, Shaheed's one of those guys that you can grab towards the tail end of your wide receiver drafting and really finish it out or start closing it out pretty nicely. One thing I do want to mention is that San Francisco's offense, very heavy on the top 4 guys last year. 80% of the targets went to the main 4 guys. That's a big deal if Shaheed's the number 2, or I assume he's the number 2 here and ahead of the running backs. So that, yards after the catch is something that offense stresses. Maybe there's even some, not 60-yard touchdown upside here for Shaheed. Maybe he can actually get some run rate points to pad his floor as well. Okay, so let's talk about Wan'Dale Robinson. He is now up to 167. I'm not necessarily sure this is about Wan'Dale Robinson, Kyle. I do think that, like I said, wide receiver falls off a cliff, and people are just figuring out that there's not really very many better options to take at wide receiver than him. But what are you doing? Are you buying or selling Wan'Dale?
Yeah, I'll be buying. I definitely don't want to go overboard on pretty much anybody in the New York offenses. I'm not super high on them, but in general, he's essentially free. And considering I probably won't be getting to a ton of Malik Neighbors at that price, I don't mind throwing a dart on one of these Giants wide receivers. And Robinson is definitely my preferred option there. He has a nice role. He's carved out a nice spot in this Giants offense as long as he can stay healthy. That's been the real kryptonite for him over the last couple of years is his inability to stay on the field. But when he's on the field, running slot routes at 79% of the time, that can be a pretty lucrative spot here. So as long as he can stay healthy, I think he does have a nice role carved out and does have some upside, not necessarily from a spike week perspective, but just from one of those safety guys that can kind of potentially provide a stable number throughout the course of the season.
I don't know if there's a bigger gap between the wide receiver 1 and wide receiver 2 in the entire draft. Neighbors is going in the top couple of picks, and then you're not seeing another Giants pass catcher go until like the 160s. So I don't know if it's that big of a spread, to be honest. And that's really why I'm going to take a couple of chances on him, albeit not really expecting all that much. The price is just a little bit too good to say no completely. Let's talk about Jaylen McMillan, because for some reason he's been getting a big spike lately. And I do think it's probably has to do with the OTA season and the reports that he's out there looking pretty good. And to be honest, he does look pretty good to me as a prospect. But what are you doing? Are we buying or selling McMillan even at this price tag of 196 for our best ball drafts?
Yeah, again, like essentially free, so it's not the end of the world. But for the majority of the time, I'm going to be selling here. I'm not overly high on McMillan in this spot. I do think he's a good talent. I don't mind him as a prospect. But I just don't think it's all that clear of a path to a role here. The Bucs are obviously going to use their top 2 receivers. They're going to use the running backs, and obviously they're going to have some tight end involvement as well. And then you have to, counter the fact that he might not even necessarily be the favorite to be the number 3 here with Trey Palmer there. So plenty of guys below the top 2 that I think are also going to kind of hold up McMillan here.
Can you imagine how pissed Trey Palmer is waking up to see that people are talking about Jaylen McMillan taking his job? If you were here for that saga last year with the Trey Palmer tweets, that he on days he scored touchdown tweeted that he was pissed. Well, I imagine he's pretty pissed about this. I'm selling as well. I'm not like you said, it's 196, so you definitely can have a little flexibility, but you're probably looking at a 0 to me, or not very many fantasy points as it would compare to some other options that you could draft down there at the end of drafts. Okay, let's talk about some guys who are descending in their ADP. Let's talk about Nick Chubb, because I think a lot of people are looking at Nick Chubb and they're seeing 138 ADP and they're like, whoa, look at the upside here. I don't necessarily agree. I'm pretty short on Nick Chubb. How do you feel about this situation?
Yeah, I feel the same. I think there's a lot of still uncertainty about his ability to return at a reasonable timeline. Obviously, we haven't got a ton of significant news that provide any sort of real details. So there is some speculation involved, which you never really like to do with injuries. But it was a brutal injury, and he's had the injury history in the past. He's getting a little older, and quite frankly, they have guys around him that can contribute to a committee that I think are pretty decent options there. So unless we get some real positive reports about him returning early on in the season, I'm probably going to remain pretty low on Chubb here.
Yeah, I would just say that 29 years old, 3 ACL surgeries, at least 8-month recovery window, probably a little bit more for something this devastating on a multi-repaired knee. I mean, they're not going to be giving him workload usage when he comes back. I think that's probably the bigger thing for me is even if he's back on time, like how long is it going to be until he's seeing 50% of the snaps? I'm not even sure that we're going to see that at all. So, I mean, again, that's all speculation as far as how much usage he's going to see in the season, what he could actually be. I just would expect that for me, I think he's going to miss at least a little bit of time. And if he doesn't miss any time, I'm not sure he's going to be that great. So I don't mind letting other people take this. I just don't think the ceiling is very high. Even if he gets to, outperforming this draft status, I don't think it's going to be by a lot. Let's talk about TJ Hawkinson. Similar situation. Actually, the first 3 guys we're going to talk about here are all injury guys that have. Now, keep in mind, their ADPs are dropping. So I'm agreeing with the market here, basically, that these are guys to stay away from. And I couldn't agree more on TJ Hawkinson. DraftKings posted a prop for a little while of 775 receiving yards. I smashed it. I could not wait to get my money in on TJ Hawkinson's unders because I don't think he's even going to be available for half the season.
Yeah, and we've gotten those reports, right? That there was a 4 to 8 week potential timeline for him to miss into the season. So when you're getting those kinds of reports, we were talking about it in the internal Slack, and it was very strange that he injured his knee in December, and they waited until late January to perform on it. So that was already a pretty big red flag. And then I think you could potentially bring up red flags about his role in potential production, even if you were healthy. Obviously not at this ADP, but you can make the case that with no Kirk Cousins, who knows what kind of offense J.J. McCarthy is going to run here. It could be a more run-heavy team. Jordan Addison could take a step forward. Obviously, Justin Jefferson's going to always be involved here. So I think there are already red flags around Hawkinson, and then you imply the knee injury as well. Obviously, the ADP is low and it's dropping, which I agree with you rightfully. So I would not be surprised if he doesn't return until midway through the year.
Yeah, so I'm out on Hawkinson. Even if he comes back, ACL repairs are not necessarily going to allow for the same level of upside as before they were injured, at least not in the first year. Not usually. That's just what the history books tell us. That's, I want to shout out the injury doctor, Edwin Porras on Twitter. He's been really phenomenal in reporting some of these injuries. And I was listening to him quite a bit there as far as, the insight on what the recovery timeframes look like for Hawkinson. I thought that was some great work that they did over at Fantasy Points on Hawkinson. Mike Williams, similar situation here, Kyle. He is coming off the ACL. He's not that good to begin with. Coming into a new situation wide receivers have struggles as it stands. Not the number one in this offense. A lot of check minuses against Mike Williams. I'm selling. What are you doing?
Yeah, I think for the most part I'm selling, but I wouldn't hate drafting him if he were to fall. I think when you say, Mike Williams, not all that good to begin with, I think that's fair. And I think there's, maybe some room to assume that he's probably not going to be, better coming back from this injury. However, one guy who I am certain of that is bad is Allen Lazard. And Allen Lazard had an 8-touchdown season with Aaron Rodgers just a few years ago. So if Mike Williams can take on sort of that red zone role, potentially be a guy who has a couple of weeks where he scores 2 touchdowns, I really wouldn't be surprised if he is just simply a red zone body. And that could be a lucrative role with Aaron Rodgers. Obviously, a lot of uncertainty there with Aaron Rodgers also being healthier, and it's clearly going to be the Garrett Wilson and Breece Hall show. But again, this is sort of one of those things where maybe leaning into that volatility could pay off here a touch, just because of the fact that if Mike Williams can cash in on 2 weeks where he scores a long touchdown or maybe scores 2 touchdowns, he could definitely be a guy who can provide some value at this ADP. So I think it's probably a guy I'm not overly high on, but if he continues to drop, I definitely don't mind it.
Yeah, I'm just going to continue to stay bearish on him. I don't care how many times you tell me you're buying Mike Williams. Like I don't want to be a buyer on ACL injury wide receivers who can't get separation to begin with. Just flat out, just not my guy. You can have him. Okay, let's talk about the Broncos situation. This is a cute one on Twitter recently, right? So one of the Denver radio stations came on and said, Javonte Williams isn't a lock to make the roster. And everyone freaked out. And you know what? I actually think that that's not totally false. I mean, there's no guarantees that Javonte Williams makes the roster, but his stock is falling as a result. What are we doing with Javonte Williams? I also want to add that Jaleel McLaughlin is now up to 160 as it stands. Jaleel McLaughlin, of course, the answer to the question, what if Rico Dowdle played on a bad team? Give me your take here on the Broncos situation. Are you buying or selling?
If he's going to continue to drop, I'll buy up some Javonte Williams here. And if in turn McLaughlin's going to continue to rise, he's getting to a point where I would probably start to have less interest. It just comes down to one of these things where I think that this is easily a spot where the market could be overreacting and just be flat out wrong on a report. Just a few weeks ago, we got word that Zach Wilson was, participating as the QB1 in the same camp. So I don't think that's going to be the case throughout the year. I think Bo Nix is probably going to start week 1. And so I think there can be a lot of nonsense reports. There can be a lot of great information that comes from camps as well and from beat writers, but there can also be a lot of stuff that you need to weed through, and that could easily be this year. But this is causing some pretty rapid movements in the market here. So I'm totally fine with buying up some Javonte Williams here. He actually looked pretty good coming off of the knee injury last year. He gets another year to sort of, get back to what he was a couple of years ago. And obviously that was an immense talent there. So I definitely don't mind taking some shares here of Javonte Williams.
I mean, I'll have some, but let's face it, I don't want to get overly bullish on what's going to happen here. I think McLaughlin, of course, will actually be the safest one. I do think that he's going to be there no matter what. If you look, I don't think he's the one that's getting cut, right? I think Perrine certainly has a big chance of being that guy. But again, I don't think this is clear as day in any way, shape, or form. And nor do I think if I'm right about it, I'm actually going to experience the benefits I think I'm going to experience. Let's say if I am right and McLaughlin is a pretty major player in this team, there's no guarantees that he's an absolute smash in fantasy. The price tag is going up for him. So again, I would have to be careful how high I actually want to take him before I have too much excitement about a running back who's 5'8" and can't pass block. All right, let's talk about the Green Bay Packers situation. The Josh Jacobs ADP is down to 50.5, and that's probably going to keep trending down just a little bit as people get more excited about Marshawn Lloyd. Now, one of the things people are excited about is that basically they're out there talking about him being the passing down work player in this offense, and that they're going to use multiple backs. That's been their philosophy with Aaron Jones in the past. Everyone wanted Aaron Jones to be on the field more than he was. Everyone's going to want Josh Jacobs to be on the field more than he's going to be on the field. But I think this is starting to get priced in. Where are we at here? Are you buying or selling Josh Jacobs as his price goes down?
Yeah, I'll be buying here. I know there's a lot of reasons to maybe not be super high on Jacobs, and I do think you bring up a lot of good points, and we'll bring up a lot of good points about Lloyd and his potential involvement in the offense. But I think this is also a spot where I tend to lean into this in best ball. I do think Jacobs, even in this role, which is going to be lower volume than his days as a Raider, I think there's still some ceiling here. And while there are downsides to that potential new role, I don't think you need him to be that guy from the Raiders when he was carrying the ball 20, 25 times a game, just because his ADP is falling. But I think there's also reason to think that, okay, the volume's falling, but maybe the efficiency will improve. I do think this is a better system. He averaged just 3.5 yards per carry last year. I don't know how much of that was just him being, bad compared to him being in a bad system and in a shaky offense. So I do think there's reasons to, maybe be a little bit higher on Jacobs from an efficiency perspective coming into this season. So with the ADP falling, if you were drafting, Aaron Jones of last couple of years at the 50th draft spot, I think there's still some value there. Obviously, I know it's not a completely perfect comparison, but I think that is sort of the world of which you're kind of leaning here for Josh Jacobs. So I don't mind buying here at this ADP.
Yeah, I'm still selling, not really because of Josh Jacobs as much as I'm just selling that roster construction. I don't like to take backs in that area of the draft, at least not through my draft so far. I'll obviously mix in some drafts where I do find guys like Jacobs in this range, but it's really just not my preferred spot to be taking running backs at this time, and that's really where I find myself not getting on Jacobs as much. I also am feeling pretty good about Marshawn Lloyd, and I do like having the much cheaper version of this backfield, especially the guy who might be out there on passing downs. But again, it's not necessarily that I think Josh Jacobs is absolutely guaranteed to be a bust as much as it is about roster construction for me. All right, Kyle, let's jump into our weekly topic this week, which is the quarterback marketplace and the quarterback tiers and the way that we sort of construct our teams as it pertains to the quarterback marketplace in 2024. First of all, let's talk about what those tiers actually are right now. In tier one, I think you've got 6 guys. You've got Josh Allen, Jalen Hurts, Jackson, Mahomes, Richardson, and Stroud. And you get to about pick 60 with that. Then you've got this next tier of guys: Kyler Murray, Burrow, Prescott, Love, Daniels, and Caleb Williams, up to about the 110th pick. Tier number 3 is guys like more pocket passers: Purdy, Lawrence, Tua, Jared Goff, Justin Herbert, Kirk Cousins. And then, of course, I'll throw Stafford in there. And then finally, everyone else we'll call tier 4, which is the really cheap guys with a little bit of uncertainty. One reason or another: Aaron Rodgers, Watson, Mayfield, Geno Smith, Will Levis, highlighting that group. Let's talk about how you go about drafting quarterbacks in this marketplace. Recognizing that those are the prices. First of all, what does your draft look like if you want to take one of these top guys, one of the top tier quarterbacks? How does that look for you? Where are you starting? And tell me about the dynamics of trying to take early quarterback in 2024.
Yeah, obviously there's a couple of strategies that we've talked about a little bit before that have sort of made drafting a quarterback early easier. Taking either hero or zero RB constructions can really alleviate some of the pressure of drafting a quarterback early, and then as well as maybe punting a tight end. Those sorts of things that can maybe open up some of the middle rounds for you there to still be able to get access to these receivers in the middle rounds and then still be able to draft an elite quarterback option. But at the end of the day, the main thing that drives my interest in my roster construction with quarterbacks is stacking. So a lot of these guys, when you're drafting them, or at least when I'm drafting them, a lot of my interest drives from how easy it is to stack them, how high of an upside I think they are as a stack, and that will sort of be a lot of maybe tiebreakers or maybe reasons to why I'm getting more of these top end quarterbacks. So, for example, a couple of the guys who I like stacking the most in this range are Mahomes and Lamar Jackson. So these 2 guys I find easier to stack with some potential correlation options that I just like in general. But to be fair, Anthony Richardson is also a guy who I like a lot, but not necessarily as a stacking option. I think he's just a great standalone quarterback option. So there's plenty of guys here with the upside in this top range. But I think those strategies that I touched on are ways that you can sort of alleviate the pressure of taking these guys to the top.
So when you're paying these top 60 prices in the market, does that necessarily force your hand at quarterback 2 to wait? Like, have you tried to take another stud quarterback, for example, or another middle round quarterback as example? Like, what's actually happening to your dynamics if you try to spend on quarterback again after already spending on the first one? Are you trying it at all?
I'm not necessarily trying it a whole lot. Honestly, I think when I am drafting at the top of the quarterback tiers, I'm expecting that quarterback to sort of carry my lineup and my roster throughout the course of the year. So I usually don't touch on, obviously not looking to touch on their guy in the tier 1 range. Tier 2 is also a spot where I don't think you necessarily need to go to a ton. I think there are some guys who have fallen to me in drafts. Jordan Love is a guy who I'm very, very high on this year. So he's a guy that I've been getting in correlation or I guess in combination with some of these tier 1 guys, but usually only in situations where he falls or in situations where I'm correlating him as well. But I definitely don't think you need to, be forcing your hand to, pair him up with another guy. There's plenty of guys down the board that we'll talk about who have strong correlation options or a lot of volatility that can actually work in their favor as upside. So definitely don't think there's anything in forcing your hand there.
Usually I'm only taking 2 quarterbacks if I draft one of these guys. I'm not interested in doing the 3 quarterback thing if I've got a strong anchor quarterback. So that's another thing that I want to point out, that one way that I can save room for wide receivers is simply by also not drafting additional quarterbacks so that I can pick up an extra one late. And you mentioned your favorites in the strategy so far. So move on to our tier 2 quarterbacks. So now we're not drafting quarterback in the first 6 rounds. That's opening the door for us to do what? What are we spending on instead of quarterback now that we're waiting onto tier 2 to draft our quarterback?
Yeah, this opens up to you either, really loading up on wide receivers at the top of your drafts, or potentially drafting one. You could draft two running backs at the early part of your draft if you wanted to, or it allows you to, spend up on a more elite tight end. And there are a couple of those elite tight ends that do pair nicely with back end quarterbacks as well. I shouldn't even say back end, but tier 2 or tier 3 quarterbacks as well. So, there's a lot of flexibility added using this strategy as well.
Yeah, and for me, looking at this range, I really have been intrigued that Joe Burrow is dropping in price because I do think that he's my favorite in this tier just because of the situation in Cincinnati. I do think they're going to have to be more pass heavy this year. I do think they're going to be more reliant on Joe Burrow, and quite frankly, he's cheap. So like the combination of a little bit of stability with high upside, weak potential, and a dropping price will really have me interested in trying to stack Joe Burrow right now. And that allows me, again, if I actually want to try to get a second strong running back, even if we're talking about around 7, 8, 9 running back, as opposed to really truly going for volatile running back strategy, waiting to the very end of the range there in zero running back land to take your first running back. I do think that you can probably take as many as two and Joe Burrow and still have a team that's decent, saving some money elsewhere for wide receivers. Getting into the strategy, who's your favorite player to take when you're doing a middle round wide receiver or quarterback as your top choice?
Yeah, I think Burrow's probably the first one, obviously piggybacking off what you said, or Jordan Love. But I do think a lot of the quarterbacks in the, that tier 2 to tier 3 range can sort of clump up. So again, it sort of just also depends on where I went earlier in the draft. If I have a stacking, like let's say I start the draft with CeeDee Lamb, would definitely lean Dak Prescott over guys like Love and Burrow. So I think a lot of these guys are sort of interchangeable to where stacking companions can easily alter my sort of favorite any given draft.
Yeah, and that's something we touched on at the beginning, right? We're just sort of speaking in general terms, like if you only could do one draft, who are your favorite guys is really more than I'm talking about. Obviously, we want to be flexible if we're doing multiple drafts and get exposure to a bunch of different guys. Okay, so let's talk about waiting altogether on quarterback, getting down to the very late tiers, tier 3 and below, to take our first quarterback. This is a strategy that is really allowing us to load up on skill players, right? Like, and I've done this a number of times where I'm just I'm firing out 8 wide receivers in the first 12 rounds for sure, and then just not touching wide receiver for the rest of the draft. Instead, going for multiple quarterbacks. I would say 3 is the number that we should be aiming for. Talk about this strategy, waiting on quarterback. How do your teams look? How do you feel about the strategy this season?
Yeah, I really don't mind it. Honestly, I think that there are a lot of guys in this, especially in this tier 3 range, but even there's a couple guys in that tier 4 range. I know we kind of snuck Stafford into that tier 3 option, but there's some guys here who I, really like within stacks. Trevor Lawrence, Tua, Goff, Cousins, Stafford. You can even make, a long shot case for Rodgers there with how cheap he is. So there's plenty of guys here in this range. And I do agree with you. If you are leaving quarterback until the later parts in the draft, you should be getting at least 2. I think 3 is the great number, though. Like 3 guys in this range should be the number that you're looking for, just to sort of insulate yourself from some of the the other teams in your groups or leagues that have the top quarterback. Obviously shuffling these guys around gives you access to 3 different options not only within stacking options for ceilings, but also just from a quarterback in general. You can maybe sort of insulate yourself from some of the comparison of upside from the quarterback 1 option to a couple of guys within this tier 2, tier 3, tier 4 range. So I definitely think 3 is the number. I would agree with you as well.
Yeah, and I would say that you're taking 3 instead of 2 because you want to counterbalance the loss of some of that upside, especially the rushing upside of those top guys, and really trying to play spike week roulette with 3 lesser players. And you probably want to be stacking them too, because these guys are not as likely to go off on their own, and certainly less likely to get rushing touchdowns. And these are the times guys are going to come with them when they have big spike weeks. So you probably want to have those players on your team as well. So when it gets down to that, 4th tier, there's a lot of guys that have some uncertainty. JJ McCarthy, Drake May, Bo Nix, the Raiders quarterbacks, Daniel Jones, Deshaun Watson, injury-wise, not that crystal clear that he's going to be great this year as far as throwing the ball is concerned. And then Bryce Young had a terrible rookie season, but the Panthers made some really strong moves in the offseason. What are we talking? Who's the best chance of those guys to do something? Because there's going to be times if you're making a lot of drafts that you're going to be picking one of these guys, and you may even have to. So where are you going first?
Yeah, I think it's easy to say Daniel Jones here in this range just because I think he probably has the most rushing upside of all these guys here. I mean, you could argue maybe J.J. McCarthy is able to translate some of what he did in college on the ground into the pros as well. So I think Daniel Jones is the easiest one to draft here, especially if you don't necessarily have a full stack thought out here. But awkwardly enough, I think Drake May is probably at the top of the list for me. I think the main reason why I'm sort of siding here is, looking back at the draft the past couple of years, the Patriots have actually gone a little bit differently, and they've actually splurged, not necessarily spent highly on some of these guys, but they've brought in a handful of different options offensively from a pass catching perspective, and a lot of them have really burned out or not appear to be all that good. But I do wonder what if some of that is just contributing to that just because of the poor quarterback play, and if Drake May is worthy of that third overall draft pick. Is he able to come in and really improve this offense as a whole? I do think it might take some time for May to be fully acclimated as a starter, but I do think that if there is some upside there, he could also maybe extend some of these guys' ceilings from a pass catcher perspective as well. I also do think McCarthy has some upside just because of the fact that I do think he has a strong play caller and a strong offensive scheme and has some very good to obviously elite weapons with Justin Jefferson there. So I think there are a couple of guys, but those are the ones that would stand out.
When you circling back to our principles to start the show and to the idea that this is an ADP show and talking about being able to eclipse your draft price by a large degree, I think Drake May is pretty easily, from that perspective, the best, right? Because he's prices down for uncertainty reasons. He's maybe not even going to start the year, so people are certainly not going to want to be drafting a guy who's not the starter day one. But if you look at a guy who can run, a guy whose price is extremely cheap, and by the end of the season, when the money starts flying, having a guy who can run on an offense could not be priced any lower at this point in time. If they overperform at all in those weeks, that could be good news for drafting a guy like May when it comes to receiving profits on your investment. Closing questions, Kyle. At the quarterback position, bottom line, who's the best value on the board right now? What Stonk, I should say, are you buying at the quarterback position? Best value on the board.
Yeah, in terms of from a value perspective, I do think that a guy like Jaden Daniels stands out. I know he's still being drafted as the 11th or 12th quarterback on the board, but I think the rushing upside there, as well as the ability for him to sort of stack nicely with some pass catching options as well. I do think that he has a really strong chance at not only paying off his price tag, but just really, being a top 6 or 7 quarterback this year, just based on the rushing upside that he has. Him and Jordan Love, I think, would stand out the most for me. Jordan Love, I absolutely love this year. I think he has a lot of strong weapons around him. The price tag isn't necessarily cheap, so you can probably find some guys who might have a better chance to pay off that price tag just because of how cheap they are. But those are two guys that I'm really, really high on this year.
Yeah, I would just say Trevor Lawrence is my guy right now. Dude, the Jaguars are going to throw it all over the place. They can't run block. Peterson's throwing over expectation every single year. I just think that for as underwhelming as Lawrence has been from a real life perspective, I think for fantasy he was all right at times last year, and I do think that there could still yet be some upside undiscovered in his profile, especially since he can run. There's definitely a lot to be had here for a very cheap price in Trevor Lawrence. So I do think he's probably the best, quote unquote, value on the board at the quarterback position as of today. So who are you selling short? Who's the worst? I wouldn't say the worst value, but what player are you just not excited about, buying puts on, whatever you want to call it, selling when it comes to the quarterback position?
Yeah, I hate to do it because this guy, I feel like, has gotten a lot of real life criticism over the past few years and isn't really necessarily worthy of that. But it's going to be Brock Purdy for me. And it's not necessarily anything to do with Brock Purdy as an individual. It just comes down to the stacking of Brock Purdy. Obviously, he can be drafted a little bit later in drafts, so that takes some of the pressure off. But obviously, a guy that you could argue is maybe the top stacking candidate for him is his running back, Christian McCaffrey. we've talked about it quite a few times this offseason about maybe them using him more as a pass catcher with, maybe some weaknesses in their offense there. But there's obviously some question marks with Brandon Ayuk, Deebo Samuel's a little bit, I guess fragile with his health concerns there. So it just comes down to stacking for me. I'm not overly excited about George Kittle this year. So Brock Purdy's going to be the guy that I'm selling short on. And that's not necessarily anything to do with all of him as a player, but the stack as a general.
Yeah, and that's a pretty good choice there as far as that's concerned. I'm not going to disagree too much with that sentiment. Folks, that's going to do it for Stonk Watch here, episode number 1. You can come over to RotoGrinders and find some rankings for best ball. We've got a top stacks tool over here. And just generally speaking, we're going to be covering football all throughout the 2024 season. Thanks very, very much for joining us. For Kyle Murray, I'm Chris Gimino. We'll check you out next week on Stonk Watch.